Hey guys, picture this. You're stepping into a midnight desert house, the air thick with the sharp bite of onions and the faint hiss of ancient incense. And suddenly, a garland of bulbous onions swings over the doorway like a cheeky security guard. Yeah, the ancient Egyptians actually used onions as their version of a keep out sign. Before we dive deeper, smash that like button if you love weird history hacks, and drop a comment telling us the strangest door daker you've ever seen. And while you're at it, dim the lights, grab a snack, and brace yourself for a pungent time travel tale. You'll soon discover that those layered, tear-inducing veggies weren't just kitchen leftovers, but a full-blown aromatic firewall against evil spirits and disease. Because the ancient mind thought a stinky onion could outsmell a cursed mummy any day. Imagine the scent sharp, almost metallic, like a fresh-cut onion, meets the dusty breath of a sarcophagus, invading every crack of the threshold, making you wonder if the pharaohs were the original hipsters of natural pest control. So stay with me, because by the end you'll understand why your grandma's onion soup might actually be a secret heirloom of protective magic. In the early heat of Thebes, the city's stone streets glistened with a thin veil of dust as the sun lifted from the horizon. Young scribe Neferu, ink still drying on his reed brush, received a modest summons from the high priest, whose face remained a dim silhouette behind the doorway's shadow. He was asked to stand beside the doorway of his own modest home and watch the practiced hands of the temple workers knot together thin, white onion stalks into a modest garland. The garland, bright as a peeled layer, was then slipped over the lintel, its pungent perfume rising like a quiet challenge to any unseen visitor. This simple rite, recorded in the palace archives, marked the first movement of the day's quiet ceremony, setting the tone for Neferu's attentive notebook. As the sun climbed, a thin veil of onion scent curled through the narrow alley, stirring the market stalls where merchants clanged copper pots and bargained over barley. The high priest's whispered instruction lingered, asterisk, the layers must be whole, the knots tight, lest restless whispers slip through the cracks of the doorway, asterisk. Neferu felt a subtle pressure in his chest, as if the invisible threads of belief were being stretched, and the clatter of a distant cart seemed louder than usual. A child tugged at his mother's linen dress, eyes darting toward the doorway, and the mother's hand trembled while adjusting the garland's placement. The air grew warmer, and the onion's sharp edge prickled the nostrils of passers-by, creating a shared, uneasy awareness of something that might be kept at bay only by smell. In that moment, the routine felt less a habit and more a guarded line, a thin barrier against the unseen that made the street's ordinary rhythm pulse with a faint, nervous beat. When the final knot was tied, a low chuckle escaped an older baker whose apron was stained with flour, his voice carrying the irony of a man who sold sweet dates, yet now inhaled bitter onion vapor. He gestured toward the garland, noting that the onions, once prized for their ability to draw out toxins, now seemed to be the very thing that made the household air taste of tears. A servant woman, balancing a basket of figs, paused to wipe a stray tear from her cheek, then laughed softly at the absurdity of fighting spirits with kitchen vegetables. The high priest, still a silhouette, gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that human attempts at protection were as fragile as the papyrus scrolls they copied. The street's chatter resumed, and the onion garland swayed gently in the breeze, its scent lingering like a quiet joke that the city had heard countless times before. As twilight painted the walls of Thebes in soft amber, the bustling market quieter, and the onion perfume settled into a low, comforting hum. Neferu returned to his modest doorway, the garland now a familiar weight against the cool stone, and he placed a small clay jar of water beside it, watching the reflected light flicker. The sounds of a distant lute softened, and a group of women began to share figs in the courtyard, their laughter barely rippling the air. The high priest's shadow had already slipped back into the sanctuary, leaving only the faint outline of his robe against the dim doorway. The onion's sharp edge mellowed with the night, becoming less a warning and more a lingering reminder that daily life continued despite the unseen. In the hush, Neferu traced the thin fibers of the garland with his fingertip, feeling the rough skin of the onion stalks under his palm, a tactile echo of the day's ritual. Later, under a sky bruised with the first stars, Neferu recorded his observations, noting how the layered onions mirrored the layered stories of each household in Thebes. He wrote that the garland's scent, though meant to repel, also invited neighbors to linger, sharing a breath of common humanity amid whispered superstitions. The scribe realized that protection in his city was less about sealing doors and more about weaving simple gestures that kept people's attention on the present moment. As the night grew cooler, the onion garland released a faint, sweetened aroma, reminding him that even the sharpest defenses soften with time. Neferu closed his tablet, feeling the weight of the reed brush against his palm, and understood that history itself rests on such modest, repetitive acts that carry both meaning and modest folly. The city settled into sleep, the onion garland a silent sentinel, and the calm of the night whispered that every layer, whether onion or memory, eventually returns to the earth. Neferu walked the narrow mud brick path that traced the Nile, the wind carrying a thin, sharp scent of fresh onions that rose from the low, green rows. The sun pressed down with with a steady, warm weight, making the sand under his sandals glow like parchment. He could hear the distant murmur of water against the banks, a low, reassuring hiss that steadied his breath. Ahead, the fields stretched in orderly lines, each stalk bending slightly under the weight of its papery skin. In this quiet morning, the promise of a simple task felt as solid as the stone walls of his village. At the edge of the field, a rival merchant named Hesse set up a modest stall, his woven basket brimming with tangled onion garlands already tied into loose knots. Hesse's voice rose a notch, offering the bundles at a lower price, his eyes flickering with a subtle challenge. Neferu felt the heat of the moment thicken, as the distant call of a crane seemed to echo the tension between the two men. The air grew a fraction warmer, the sun catching the dust that rose as they shifted their weight on the cracked earth. Yet, the simple act of choosing a garland lingered, a quiet contest of pride and practicality under the endless sky. The irony of the scene lay in the onion itself, a humble vegetable, peeled layer by layer, yet revered as a shield against unseen harm. While Hesse argued about price, the farmer beside him whispered that the onion's scent kept flies at bay, a quiet defense that was both practical and symbolic. The blurred silhouette of the sun god, hidden behind a veil of light, seemed to watch the exchange without judgment, as if amused by humans attributing divine weight to a kitchen staple. Neferu noted how the same layers that made the onion tearful when cut were also its strength, absorbing moisture and deterring decay. In the gentle murmur of the field, the absurdity of such a tiny plant holding protective power felt both earnest and mildly humorous, a reminder of the small ways people seek safety. The farmer, an older man with weather-worn hands, bent down to pull a fresh stalk, feeling the slick surface of the outer skin and passing it to Neferu. He explained, in measured tone, that the onion's sulfur compounds acted as natural antiseptics, keeping the doorway free from rot and pest. He also mentioned that ancient scribes had linked the bright, golden hue of the onion's inner layers to the first light of Ra, a connection formed more by observation than by worship. The conversation drifted like the slow flow of the river, each word landing softly on the dusty ground. Neferu listened, the heat now a mellow backdrop to the practical wisdom, and the tension eased into a quiet acceptance of the vegetable's humble role. When the sun began to dip, casting amber shadows over the fields, Neferu carried a handful of garlands back to his home, the scent of onion lingering in his clothes. He draped the bundles across the stone lintel of his doorway, feeling the papery layers brush against his fingertips, a subtle reminder of the day's modest exchange. As the night settled, he sat on the low stool by the hearth, listening to the soft crackle of fire and the distant croak of frogs. The garlands, unassuming yet purposeful, seemed to hold a quiet promise that the household would be kept safe from the small, unseen irritations of daily life. In the stillness, Neferu allowed a soft smile, appreciating how ordinary efforts stitched together the fabric of his world. As the summer heat waned, the limestone walls of Thebes began to echo the soft clatter of preparations for the Apit festival. Market stalls laid out rows of papyrus scrolls and jars of figs, while artisans polished wooden statues that would later ride in the procession. Among the quieter tasks, women carried bundles of white onions, their papery skins catching the late afternoon light as they threaded them into simple garlands. The custom, recorded in the scribes' accounts, held that these fragrant loops would line each doorway, a modest barrier against the unseen. Children watched the garlands sway, their breath warm against the stone, unaware of the subtle purpose they fulfilled. When the Nile failed to rise, a thin crust of dust settled over the courtyard, and the scent of wilted grain replaced the usual perfume of reeds. The priest, his face obscured by the deep shadow of his linen hood, warned that without the onion garlands, the thresholds would become vulnerable to restless forces that prowled through arid streets. He spoke in measured tones, the murmur of his voice mingling with the distant creak of shutters as the wind skimmed the city walls. Merchants paused their bartering, listening to the low warning as if it were a fragile thread stretched over a chasm. The urgency settled like a thin film of heat on the people's shoulders, prompting a hush that lingered over the market. In spite of the looming threat, the courtyard burst into a quiet scramble as families gathered the scant onions from their modest stores, each bulb weighing like a small, reluctant promise. Some mothers exchanged a withered leek for a handful of onions, trading the unusual with a half smile that hinted at the irony of barter in desperate times. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, asking why a simple vegetable could keep darkness at bay, while the overseer of the grain silos chuckled softly, his laughter echoing against the stone as if to remind everyone that fear often wears a familiar mask. The air grew thick with the sharp scent of cut onions, a scent that both cleared the sinuses and underscored the absurdity of the moment. Yet the community moved with a steady rhythm, their motions as patient as the slow tilt of the sun across the sky. When the final garland was draped over the last doorway, a gentle coolness seemed to settle within the stone, as if the onions had inhaled the heat and exhaled a quiet relief. The doors, now lined with layered rings of white, stood solemnly against the evening hush, their hinges creaking a soft, approving sigh. Festival lanterns were lit, casting amber pools that reflected off the polished copper of the priests' vessels, while distant chants rose in a low, melodic tide. The city's heart beat at a measured pace. The earlier tension dissolved into a calm that wrapped each street like a warm shawl. Even the shadows along the walls appeared more relaxed, their outlines softening as the night approached. Later, as the procession faded into the night, and the last ember of the festival fire flickered out, the people lingered by their doors, feeling the faint weight of the onion loops against their palms. They understood, without spoken doctrine, that the ritual was less about warding off unseen forces than about weaving a shared moment of care into the fabric of daily life. The simple act of tying bulbs together became a quiet testament to resilience, a reminder that even modest gestures can stitch together a community when the river runs dry. In the quiet aftermath, the city breathed a collective sigh, its stones holding the memory of a night when ordinary vegetables held extraordinary meaning. The story of those garlands lingered like a soft whisper, echoing through the ages as a gentle lesson in human perseverance. At the edge of Thebes, a group of women gathered in the cool shade of a mud brick courtyard, their fingertips brushing the papyrus rolls that listed the day's market prices. They wound long strands of fresh onion stalks into simple garlands, the layers of pale skin glistening with a faint sheen of morning dew. The scent was sharp but clean, a reminder of the earth from which the vegetables were pulled. Children paused their game of knucklebones to watch the rhythm of the braid, their eyes half closed in the slow afternoon light. As the last knot was tied, the women slipped the garlands onto the wooden lintels of their homes, a quiet habit that had endured for generations. Later that night, the sky over Thebes stretched black and unmoving. The usual chorus of crickets hushed as a heavier stillness settled. From the fields beyond the city, a swarm of gnats and flies, swollen with the season's fever, drifted toward the faint glow of oil lamps leaking amber light. Their wings brushed against stone and mud, a low, relentless hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The households felt a subtle shift in the air, a faint pressure that pressed against the backs of necks as the insects approached doorways. Mothers tightened shutters, while fathers whispered hurried prayers, their faces blurred by the flickering shadows. When the first insects brushed the onion garlands, a thin vapor rose, sharp as cut glass, scattering the swarming bodies like droplets on a pane. The insects recoiled, their wings beating erratically before turning away, leaving the doorways quiet once more. The people inside exchanged uneasy glances, a half smile forming on a tired baker's lips as he realized the simple stalks were doing more than ornamenting their homes. The sound of the insects' retreat faded into the night, replaced by the soft creak of wooden doors settling. In that moment, the ordinary act of hanging onions acquired an unspoken authority, a quiet joke of nature and belief intertwining. By dawn, the city breathed easier, the shutters stayed open, and the courtyard walls bore no sign of the nocturnal invasion. Women returned to their weaving, their hands moving with a steadier rhythm, the garlands now resting lightly against the stone, still faintly scented. The bakers opened their ovens, the heat mingling with the lingering onion sharpness, creating a warm, comforting aroma that seemed to reward the night's uneasy vigil. Children resumed their games, the clatter of wooden toys echoing softly against the stillness that had settled over the streets. The households, relieved but not startled, carried on with their daily chores, the episode slipping into the background of ordinary life. Later, when the city's scribes recorded the event on brittle papyrus, they noted the peculiar effectiveness of the onion garlands without invoking grand divine intervention, as if the world itself had offered a modest remedy. The story lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, a reminder that simple observations could outweigh elaborate rites. Generations would repeat the practice, each not a silent tribute to the night when vapor chased away a swarm. While the people learned to trust the modest gifts of their own gardens. In the quiet evenings that followed, the scent of onions remained a gentle whisper at the thresholds, a subtle testament to human adaptability. The night's lessons settled into the collective memory, an understated echo of how ordinary care can shape the rhythm of a community. After the flood receded, the workers in limestone dust lifted the collapsed bricks of Thebes, and Neferu, with a reed pen, began to record the day on papyrus. The sun hung low, casting a warm amber over the newly repaired doorways, where families hung thin strings of onion skins, their papery layers glistening like quiet flags. The onions had been gathered at dawn, their skins brushed by cool river breezes and the soft chatter of market women. Neferu noted the scent that drifted from the garlands, a sharp yet comforting note that seemed to stitch the broken walls back together. In the quiet of the evening, the scribe felt the weight of history settle on the threshold, as if each layer of the onion echoed a layer of memory. As the city settled, a sudden swarm of grain beetles slipped through cracked shutters, their rustle unsettling the newly sealed rooms. The cooks heard the faint crunch of insects beside their millet, and mothers tightened their gaze on the darkened thresholds, fearing that the unguarded doorways would invite more invasion. The heat of the day lingered on stone, making the air feel heavy, and the silence in the corridors grew taut like a stretched reed. Neferu wrote of the unease, describing how the once pleasant aroma of onions now seemed a thin veil against a creeping menace. The tension lingered, a quiet pressure that pressed against the skin of every passerby. Yet the priests, whose faces were forever hidden in the flickering torchlight, suggested that the onion's many layers might mirror the layers of protection the gods offered, a notion that drew a muted chuckle from the laborers stacking mud bricks. The onions, ordinary and pungent, were hung with the same solemnity as a royal seal, prompting the younger apprentices to wonder if a vegetable could truly hold back a pest. A few skeptical men tapped the garlands, noting how the dry skins cracked softly under their fingertips, as if the onions themselves were sighing. The irony lay in the simplicity of the remedy, a humble kitchen staple standing guard over stone doorways, while the city's elite debated grander charms. The laughter was soft, more a ripple than a roar, as the scent of onions floated past the vaulted halls. In the weeks that followed, the onion garlands settled into a rhythm as natural as the Nile's ebb, their sharp scent mingling with the cool night breezes that slipped through the open windows. Children paused their games to inhale the familiar bite, and the scent seemed to smooth the rough edges of daily chores, turning the act of sweeping the floor into a quiet meditation. Neferu observed the way the garlands swayed gently in the wind, their layers rustling like distant pages of an unwritten story, and the city's heartbeat steadied under that modest guard. The doors remained closed against intrusion, not through force, but through the persistent presence of a modest plant. A calm settled over the streets, as steady and warm as the terracotta tiles beneath tired feet. Now, years later, Neferu's papyrus rests in a cool alcove, its ink faded yet still whispering of onion garlands and the patience they taught. He reflects that each layer of onion peeled away reveals another, just as each generation uncovers another stratum of tradition, each one fragrant with the memory of those who dared to hang a simple garland over a doorway. The lingering scent serves as a reminder that protection can be quiet, that resilience often smells of earth and tear sweetness rather than thunder. In the quiet of the museum-like hallway, the story folds back on itself, a loop of observation that comforts the weary traveler. The legacy of layers, both in the vegetable and in history, endures, inviting the listener to rest their eyes upon the soft glow of a lamp and the gentle promise of another night. The sun hung low over Thebes, painting the market stalls in a warm amber glow. Vendors shouted soft prices while jars of dates clinked against each other, and the air smelled of baked flatbread and river mud. Neferet, a young scribe with ink stains on her fingers, moved between piles of papyrus, noting the cadence of daily barter. At a modest stall draped in linen, Priestess Mariette stood, her face hidden in the shade of a woven canopy, offering a single, unassuming onion wrapped in reed twine. She handed the bulb to Neferet with a quiet hand, explaining that the onion served as a protective amulet, its layers echoing the promise of rebirth in the rituals to come. The crowd thickened as the midday heat pressed down, and the din of bartering grew into a low roar. Children darted like startled fish, their laughter spilling over the clatter of wooden carts. Neferet felt the onion's weight against her palm, a cool, papery surface that seemed oddly heavy for such a simple vegetable. A stray goat nudged a stall, sending a sack of onions tumbling, and for a heartbeat, the precious bulb lay exposed among its kin. The priestess's voice, muffled by the canopy, reminded her that the onion's true strength lay not in its skin, but in the intention it carried, a subtle reassurance against the chaos. The market resumed its rhythm, and the onion now sat in Neferet's satchel beside a reed brush, an ordinary object masquerading as a sacred talisman. Vendors continued to negotiate over the price of copper, oblivious to the quiet drama of a single bulb tucked away. Mariette's silhouette remained blurred by the shifting light, her gestures measured yet unremarkable, hinting at the solemnity she conveyed without grand spectacle. It was almost comical that a vegetable, peeled layer by layer by the same hands that wrote spells, could be entrusted with warding away unseen misfortune. Yet the irony deepened when a fellow scribe, laughing, offered to trade a fresh date for the onion, not recognizing the symbolic weight it held. As twilight softened the sky, Neferet followed Mariette to a modest courtyard, where an altar of white limestone stood beneath a palm frond canopy. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint scent of frankincense, mingling with the lingering aroma of river reeds. Mariette placed the onion on the altar, its pale skin catching a sliver of fading light, and whispered a low chant that blended with the distant croak of frogs. The scribe watched the onion rest beside a bowl of water, each layer seeming to pulse with a subdued promise, while the priestess's movements remained concealed in shadow. A silent breeze brushed the stone steps, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath, honoring the simple ritual without fanfare. When the ceremony concluded, the onion was returned to Neferet's satchel, its outer skin now subtly dulled by the candle smoke that had risen during prayers. She walked back through the market, the once busy stalls now quieting under the first stars, feeling the gentle weight of the bulb as a reminder of cycles both personal and cosmic. In the quiet of her study, she peeled a thin layer of the onion, the papery skin falling away like a forgotten memory, exposing a fresh, translucent circle. The act mirrored the ancient belief that each removed layer symbolized a step toward renewal, a quiet affirmation that even mundane objects bear the imprint of human hope. With a soft sigh, Neferet placed the onion beside her papyrus scrolls, accepting that the protective charm was less about magic and more about the calm certainty of being seen, however briefly, in the endless flow of the Nile. Neferet stepped through the cool sandstone archway of the Temple of Osiris at sunrise, the air scented with incense and damp linen. A small altar held a pile of freshly torn onion skins, their papery layers catching the first light like pale parchment. The senior priest handed her a single onion, its skin cool to the touch, and explained that each concentric ring was thought to mirror the successive stages of the afterlife. As she lifted the bulb, the faint rustle of palm leaves outside blended with the quiet murmur of water in the nearby basin. The stone floor, worn smooth by generations of sandals, seemed to hold the weight of the story she was about to learn. She felt the subtle weight of anticipation settle like dust on her shoulders. Later, as the day grew hotter, a rival priest named Khemu approached, his linen robe brushing the tiled floor with a soft swish. He raised a skeptical eyebrow, his face hidden in the shadow of the torches, and asked Neferet why a vegetable should command reverence in rites meant for gods. The onion was placed on a low table, and Khemu tapped its skin with a bronze stylus, producing a faint crack that echoed in the vaulted hall. Neferet answered calmly, noting the onion's ability to shed layers without loss. Yet Khemu muttered about tradition and the danger of superstition. Their voices rose just enough to stir the hanging reeds, the sound barely disturbing the stillness that clung to the columns. The tension lingered like a thin veil of heat over the courtyard stones. As the sun slipped toward the horizon, a murmuring crowd gathered, their sandals shifting on the cool mosaic while they watched the onion demonstration. The onion, now peeled to its core, lay open, its inner circles glistening with a faint moisture that caught the amber glow of the fading light. An unexpected chuckle rose from a young apprentice, his smile half hidden behind the shadows that fell across his cheek, as he remarked that the humble bulb seemed more patient than any priest. The irony was palpable, a simple garden plant receiving the same solemn attention as the golden scarabs that adorned the walls. Neferet felt a gentle amusement ripple through her, a quiet recognition that the ritual's power lay not in grandeur, but in shared, ordinary gestures. The audience nodded, their eyes softening as they observed the simple act of peeling. When the evening breeze brushed the temple columns, the rival priest lowered his stylus, and without a word, helped Neferet lift the onion's final layer, its scent now sharp and sweet. The ritual concluded with a quiet chant, the voices low and resonant, each word barely disturbing the still air. The priests and laypeople alike placed the peeled onion on a low platform, allowing its fragrance to mingle with the lingering incense. The stone floor, now cool under their feet, seemed to inhale the blended aromas, creating a calm that settled like a thin blanket over the gathering. Neferet watched the shadows deepen, the torches flickering gently, and sensed that the layers of belief had settled into a quiet equilibrium. The moment lingered, unhurried, as the temple returned to its usual measured rhythm. In the quiet aftermath, Neferet walked along the temple's outer wall, feeling the rough limestone against her fingertips as the night settled in. The onion's remnants, now drying on the altar, reminded her that protection often comes in modest, layered forms, not in thunderous proclamations. She reflected on the rival priest's earlier doubt, recognizing that skepticism, like an onion's outer skin, can be peeled away to reveal a shared curiosity beneath. The distant call of a nightjar echoed softly, carrying the faint sound of water dripping from a nearby cistern, a reminder of continuity beyond human ceremony. As stars began to prick the darkening sky, Neferet felt a gentle gratitude for the ordinary rituals that bind people across generations. The night wrapped the temple in a hushed embrace, and she left with the quiet certainty that even the smallest vegetable can hold a world of meaning. The sun-bleached streets of Thebes thrummed with the steady shuffle of wooden carts as the Opet festival approached. Lanterns of papyrus reed flickered against the limestone walls, casting long shadows over the rows of market stalls where onions, their skins glistening with a faint amber, lay in modest piles. Neferet, a mid-ranking steward, lifted the first bulb with a careful palm, feeling the cool, papier-like texture that promised both nourishment and ritual weight. Old scribes had recorded that the onion's layered skin symbolized the unveiling of truth, a motif the city's priests still whispered about in hushed tones. As the crowd gathered, the scent of frankincense mixed with the sharp, earthy aroma of the vegetables, creating a paradoxical perfume that seemed to suspend time. The day felt like a slow drumbeat, each moment measured, as if history itself were inhaling. By mid-morning, a thin cough began to ripple through the temple courtyards, and a pale mist rose from the Nile, carrying an unbidden chill that settled on the workers' shoulders. The priests, their faces hidden in the wavering torchlight, convened in the sanctuary, their voices low as they argued whether the onion's pungent vapor could cleanse the invisible contagion. Some clutched scrolls that listed ancient purifications, while others tapped the stone floor, feeling the vibration of a city on edge. Neferet stood at the periphery, the weight of empty baskets pressing against her thigh, aware that each postponed harvest meant one more household without grain. Outside, the market stalls emptied slowly, the clatter of barrels fading to a hushed sigh, as merchants weighed survival against the looming decree of the vizier. The air grew denser, and the quiet tension settled like dust on the threshold of the ceremony. An ironic calm settled when a messenger arrived with a royal edict ordering the onion to be offered to the pharaoh's palace. Citing its protective layers as a sign of royal safety, the decree meant the fields would lose their modest surplus, a fact that made the already scarce onion piles feel both more valuable and more trivial. Neferet, whose hands were still stained with the faint orange of soil, watched the scribes fold the parchment, their silhouettes blurred by the flickering flame. The city's administrators pressed for an immediate tribute, their expectations humming like a low drumbeat against the backdrop of a still buzzing market. Yet the low-rank workers, who had spent nights shoveling sand to protect the fields, exchanged weary smiles that hid a sharp bite of resentment, the paradox of a humble vegetable becoming a political pawn lingered. A quiet reminder of how ordinary lives are drawn into grand gestures. As evening deepened, the priests finally consented to a modest rite, sprinkling thin onion skins over the altar while the crowd stood in a gentle hush. The firelight painted the stone columns with amber strokes, and the onions sizzled lightly, releasing a steam that curled like a soft breath over the assembled faces. Neferet placed a single bulb at the foot of the statue, its cool skin a tactile contrast to the warm air, and felt a subtle release of pressure, as if the act itself acknowledged the city's fragile balance. The chants rose in a slow, measured cadence, each word falling like a feather onto the stone floor, while unseen hands adjusted the ceremonial vessels. The plague's whisper seemed to dim, not vanished, but the collective focus on the simple act offered a momentary shelter from the looming dread. In that measured pause, the city's pulse synchronized with the faint rustle of onion leaves, a quiet affirmation of resilience. When dawn broke, the market resumed its rhythm, though the onion piles were now thinner, their layers marked by the night's ceremony. Neferet walked the streets, feeling the soft grit of sand beneath her sandals, and observed children trading small pieces of dried onion for figs, their laughter a low hum against the stone walls. The priests, still cloaked in shadow, watched from a distance, their faces hidden as they noted the subtle shift in the city's mood. The plague receded, not with grandeur, but with the same steady decline of a tide, leaving behind a quiet gratitude for the modest protection offered by a simple crop. Those who had pressed for political gain found their ambitions softened by the everyday need for food, a reminder that history often turns on the smallest of layers. The episode lingered like the lingering scent of onion in the cool morning air, a gentle proof that even the most ordinary objects can bear the weight of communal hope. In the low summer heat of the Nile Delta, the market stalls glistened with the dull sheen of fresh produce, and among them a mound of onions lay like pale moons waiting to be lifted. Neferet, a modest scribe whose fingers were stained with ink, walked the narrow lane, feeling the gritty sand press against her sandals as she gathered the bulbs for the evening's purpose. The scent of the onions was sharp yet sweet, slipping unnoticed under the chatter of merchants and the clink of clay jars. She lifted each onion with careful hands, remembering the old papyrus that spoke of their tears as offerings to the unseen goddess. The quiet of the approaching dusk settled like a blanket, gentle enough to let thoughts of ritual drift into the background of everyday chores. Soon after, the village awoke to a thin cough that threaded through the households like a faint wind, and the once lively riverbanks seemed to hold their breath. The elders whispered of a pestilence that seeped from the reeds, and the air grew heavy with the metallic tang of fear, though no one could point to a source. Neferet felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders as she stood before a low stone altar, the onion skins rustling like distant paper. The moon rose, pale and unsteady, casting a soft shadow that veiled the faces of the priests, their outlines blurred by the flickering torchlight. In that hush, the community waited for the moment when the simple vegetables would be transformed into a conduit for hope. When the first slice fell onto the stone, a thin steam rose, curling upward and carrying with it a scent that reminded the listeners of kitchens and childhood lunches. Yet it also coaxed a collective sigh of unexpected mirth. The vapor, warm and pungent, seemed to stir the hidden tears of Isis, though no divine voice echoed. Instead, the people found themselves blinking, their eyes watering from the very onion they had summoned. A few children giggled as the smell tickled their noses, while the older women exchanged a quiet smile, aware of the irony that a humble kitchen staple could mimic the mournful lament of a goddess. The rhythm of the ritual continued, each cut releasing another breath of vapor, as the crowd's murmurs turned into a soft, almost reverent hush. In that paradoxical moment, the plague's grip loosened, not by thunderous miracle, but by the simple human act of sharing a shared scent. By the time the last onion was sliced, the night air felt cooler, as if the steam had carried away the lingering heat of illness. The villagers moved back to their homes, the lanterns flickering gently, casting elongated shadows that danced without urgency. Neferet stood still, the sand beneath her feet cool, and observed the quiet return of normalcy. A baker kneading dough, a fisherman mending his net, the soft rustle of curtains as families settled for sleep. The plague's presence had faded like the waning moon, leaving only the faint memory of a cough that now seemed distant. The ceremony concluded without fanfare, its success measured in the small, steady breaths of those who had waited. Later, as dawn brushed the horizon with a pale gold, Neferet reflected on the thin line between ritual and routine, noting how the onion's layers mirrored the layers of human intention. She understood that the ceremony's power lay not in divine intervention, but in the collective act of focusing on a simple, tangible object, letting its scent bind the community together. The blurred faces of the priests, forever hidden in shadows, reminded her that leadership often remains unnamed, while the real work is done by steady hands and quiet hearts. The village resumed its daily cadence, yet each bite of onion in a stew now carried a whisper of the night's calm resolve. In the end, the story lingered like the lingering aroma of a kitchen, subtle, familiar, and gently reassuring. The limestone walls of Thebes hum with the low murmur of market stalls as dawn slips over the Nile. Vendors lay bundles of papyrus and rough figs, but a modest pile of pale onions draws a steady, quiet gaze from passers-by. The chief scribe, Neferet, watches the thin skins glisten with a faint dew, noting how the onion's layers mirror the rising sun's light. In the courtyard of the temple, a handful of priests, faces softened by the early glow, their identities hidden behind the shadows of their linen headdresses, place a single onion upon the altar as a modest offering for the day's upcoming ceremony. The gesture feels simple, almost routine, yet the air carries a subtle anticipation, as if the vegetable itself were a quiet promise of renewal. By midday, the city's streets tighten with the clatter of armor as soldiers prepare to march toward the contested border. The onion, now stored in a cool, mud-clad storeroom, is whispered about among the ranks as a talisman that can ward off the unseen malice said to stalk warriors. Neferet receives a terse dispatch. The enemy forces have encircled the western outpost, and the night will be heavy with the scent of smoke. In the cramped barracks, a veteran rubs the rough, papery skin of an onion between his fingertips, feeling its cool firmness as a reminder of the layers of defense each soldier must bear. The tension hangs like the humid heat above the river, and the quiet confidence that the humble bulb offers seems both comforting and uneasy. When the battle finally ends, the river's surface reflects a pale, victorious sunrise, and the city's horns sound a low, lingering note. The victorious troops return, their sandals dusty, and the chief architect orders a new relief to be carved on the temple's western wall, insisting that the onion be the centerpiece. The sculptors, whose faces are eternally hidden behind the shade of their tools, chisel a bulb with exaggerated, almost comical curves, its layers stacked like a modest pyramid. Visitors pause, half amused, half pensive, noticing that the onion now stands beside the usual lions and sacred boats. A subtle joke, carved in stone, about the thin line between protection and absurdity. The city smiles in a tired, sleepy way, recognizing the irony that a kitchen staple has become a permanent guardian of their triumph. In the evenings, the market's lanterns cast a warm amber glow on the stone streets, and families gather around low tables to slice onions for stew. The sharp, sulfuric scent drifts through the air, mingling with the soft murmur of children reciting simple prayers, whose faces remain blurred by the flickering light. Neferet sits on a worn stool, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath his hands, and watches the layers of the onion dissolve into broth, each layer releasing a quiet, comforting hum. The relief in the temple, now half finished, catches the last rays of sun, its flat, terracotta tones echoing the muted colors of the kitchen's canvas. Life settles into a steady rhythm, as dependable as the river's flow, and the onion's presence feels as ordinary as the breath of the night wind. Years later, when scholars trace the city's archives, they note how the onion's image survived wars, floods, and the slow crumble of stone. They write that the bulb's layered form symbolized the soul's gradual shedding, each peel a memory, each scent a reminder of impermanence. Neferet's name, etched beside the vegetable, remains a muted echo, his visage concealed by the same shadow that protects the sacred texts. Visitors in modern robes pause before the relief, tracing the smooth curves with their fingertips, feeling the cool stone and the faint residue of ancient onions in the air. The tale settles into quiet contemplation, a reminder that even the simplest of vegetables can carry the weight of protection, rebirth, and the patient journey of humanity. In the heat of a Theban afternoon, the modest mud brick house rose from the packed earth like a quiet promise. Neferet, a young scribe with ink-stained fingertips, guided his mother and younger sister through the narrow alley that smelled of baked clay and incense. The doorway stood bare, its lintel dry to the touch and waiting for the day's work. Their belongings, jars of barley, A cracked reed stool, a wooden chest hummed softly as they were set down. A distant chant from a nearby shrine drifted over the rooftops, reminding them of the city's ceaseless rhythm. Yet the stillness of the unfinished threshold felt both hopeful and uncertain. Murat, the household priestess, whose eyes were always half shadowed by the veil of the lamp, arrived with a small wooden chisel and a slate of pigment. She explained, in measured tones, that the ankh, scarab, and eye of Horus were not merely decorations, but conduits that could coax the favor of invisible guardians. The family watched her hand glide over the doorway, carving the loop of the ankh with a rhythm that sounded like a soft tap against stone. As the pigment settled, a faint scent of linseed oil mingled with the dust kicked up by their movements. The children whispered doubts, feeling the weight of an old belief pressing against the fresh-cut wood. Still, the chisel's steady bite seemed to steady their own pulse, as if the act itself could seal a crack in the night. The symbols, once finished, lay flat against the mud brick, their outlines as ordinary as the cracks that ran parallel to them. Murat's silhouette remained a dark smear behind the doorway, her features softened by the flickering torchlight, making her presence feel more like a suggestion than a command. Neferet half smiled, noting how a tiny scarab could be imagined to wrestle wandering shadows that never entered the courtyard anyway. The family exchanged a quiet chuckle, aware that the real comfort lay in the familiar clatter of daily chores rather than any unseen menace. Yet the etched motifs, indifferent to the humor, continued to frame the entrance with a patient dignity. Evening settled over Thebes, and the soft orange of the setting sun brushed the doorway, casting elongated shadows that traced the carved lines. The scent of cooling mud mixed with the faint aroma of a stew simmering inside, while a gentle breeze brushed the lintel, making the pigments whisper faintly. Inside, the household moved in a slow choreography. A pot was set on the fire, a reed mat was unfolded, footsteps muffled on packed earth. The carved symbols caught the last light, their edges glowing like a quiet promise, unnoticed by any wandering spirit. The night passed without disturbance, and the family rested, comforted by the simple certainty of routine. Years later, the mud brick softened under rain, and the pigments faded to a patina that matched the house's weathered skin. Neferet, now older, traced the ankh with a fingertip that trembled like the distant Nile, recalling the day the chisel sang against stone. He realized that the protection they coveted had never been a battle against malevolent forces, but a ritual that stitched the family together through shared effort. The doorway, still bearing the scarab, and I stood as a quiet record of how ordinary hands had transformed vulnerability into a modest monument. In the hush of twilight, the lingering scent of incense reminded him that memory, more than symbol, guards the thresholds we cross. And as the stars rose above Thebes, the soft murmur of the city seemed to approve. A gentle echo of lives lived quietly beneath the same sky. The sun hung low over the mud-brick lane, painting the air with a dry amber hue. Neferet, a young apprentice, traced the outline of a scarab on a freshly carved doorway. Feeling the cool sand grain beneath her fingertips, an elder artisan whispered that the beetle symbol promised rebirth, its wings echoing the cycle of night and day. Nearby, a slender ankh was etched beside a doorway, its loop suggesting a quiet pledge of life against the desert's eroding breath. Above the lintel, the all-seeing eye was chiseled in deep relief, its gaze imagined to watch over every visitor. As the rhythmic tap of chisels blended with distant goat bleats, Neferet began to understand why each mark was more than ornament. Across the lane, the house of Hormheb stood plain, its doorway left unadorned, the plaster smooth as river stone. Hormheb dismissed the carvings as superstitious clutter, preferring the quiet of an unmarked entrance. Within weeks, a draft of sand seeped through a cracked wall, knocking over a clay jar that shattered with a thin, mournful clang. The next night, a sudden gust rattled the shutters, and a single candle flickered out, leaving the family in a brief, unsettling darkness. By the following market day, Hormheb's son returned home with a sprained ankle, the result of a toppled storage crate that seemed to fall without cause. The villagers watched the string of minor mishaps with tightened brows, the quiet rhythm of daily life now tinged with a low hum of unease. The elder who taught Neferet smiled thinly, noting that the same wind that scattered sand also brushed the scarab carved thresholds, keeping dust at bay. He pointed out that the broken jar could have lodged against the smooth plaster of Hormheb's door just as easily as against any ornament. Yet the coincidence of each incident finding its way to the unmarked home felt like a whispered joke from the very stone, a reminder that belief and misfortune often walk hand in hand. Children giggled as they whispered about the watching eye, while the adults, wary but polite, kept their voices low. The irony settled like the evening heat, a soft reminder that the world offers patterns, whether we notice them or not. In the cooling shade, Neferet watched the dust settle on the doorway, feeling the faint vibration of a shared, unspoken amusement. Days turned into a slow procession of sunrise and sunset, and the village settled back into its accustomed rhythm. Hormheb, after repairing the cracked wall, added a modest ankh above his entrance, its bronze patina catching the last light of day. The artisans continued their work, their chisels striking wood and stone with a steady, almost lullaby-like cadence that blended with the distant murmur of the Nile. Evening meals were shared on low tables, the scent of cumin and barley rising as families talked about the day's labor in hushed tones. The eye relief, now glinting softly on several doorways, seemed to watch the laughter of children as they chased dust devils across the courtyard. The heat faded, leaving a gentle coolness that slipped through the open arches, and the village breathed as one steady, unhurried organism. As the moon rose pale over the horizon, Neferet lingered by the doorway, her fingers tracing the carved lines that had become a quiet compass for her thoughts. She sensed that the symbols were less about warding off unseen forces than about giving people a sense of order amid the desert's relentless churn. The subtle comfort of a scarab or ankh lay in their promise of continuity, a reminder that each day would rise again, no matter how harsh the night. The villagers, now accustomed to the soft vigilance of their thresholds, moved with a gentle steadiness that hinted at an acceptance of both chance and tradition. In the stillness, the sounds of night insects created a low soundtrack, and the world seemed to pause, allowing the small acts of carving and caring to linger like a whispered lullaby. With a quiet smile, Neferet turned back toward the inner courtyard, carrying the calm knowledge that history, like a well-kept doorway, remains open yet unobtrusive. At dusk, the family of Neferet brushed a fresh layer of ochre across the lintel. The smooth would still warm from the workers' hands. Their doorway bore the familiar eye of Horus, flanked by neatly carved cartouches that promised protection to anyone who crossed the threshold. The scent of wet plaster mingled with the dry desert wind that slipped through the narrow alley, a reminder of the day's labor. Children shuffled past, their sandals whispering against the stone, while Murret adjusted the woven mat at the entrance. The scene settled into a quiet rhythm, as if the house itself were inhaling before night fell. When the moon withdrew behind a veil of cloud, a thin murmur rose from the street, drifting like a loose reed through the cracked walls. A cold draft sneaked under the doorway, tracing the outline of the carved symbols with a faint breath that brushed the backs of necks. The air grew denser, and the shadows along the plaster seemed to thicken, stretching just beyond the reach of candlelight. Neferet paused his evening work, feeling the unexpected chill settle on his shoulders. The ordinary sounds of the night, crickets, distant water jars clinking, were now underscored by a subtle, uneasy vibration. Ka, the youngest, stood still at the threshold, eyes widened as a darker shape lingered around the lintel, coiling like a stray thread of smoke. He whispered that the symbols might be powerless, his voice barely cutting through the persistent whisper that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The irony of a child questioning the ancient craft that his mother had so carefully preserved was not lost on the adult onlookers, who exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Murret, her hands still dusted with pigment, smiled faintly, as if amused by the child's earnest fear. The moment lingered, neither fully comforting nor wholly alarming, suspended in the hush of the night. Murret stepped forward, her fingers tracing the low relief of the protective prayer inscribed beneath the eye, the letters worn smooth by generations. She spoke softly, not with authority, but with the calm of someone who had watched many nights pass unnoticed, reminding the family that the carvings were not merely decorative, but a dialogue with the unseen. The draft seemed to lose its edge, the whisper receding like a tide pulling back from the shore. Neferet returned to his brush, adding a final stroke that completed the pattern, while Ka's shoulders relaxed as the cool air settled into a gentler sigh. The house settled back into its familiar cadence, the doorway now feeling less a portal for fear and more a quiet sentinel. At first light, the sun painted the walls in a soft amber, the carvings catching the gentle glow, as if recalling the night's quiet conversation. The family gathered for a modest meal, the clink of mud cups and the rustle of papyrus scrolls providing a steady backdrop to their reflections. Neferet thought of the imperfection in every hand-carved line, and of how such small flaws were perhaps what kept the symbols alive, rather than an unattainable perfection. Murret glanced at the doorway, a faint smile crossing her face, amused by the notion that a simple stone could bear both the weight of fear and the lightness of daily routine. In the lingering calm, the house seemed to exhale, its walls holding the night's tale without fanfare, ready for another ordinary day. In the late afternoon light, the stone doorway of Neferet's house caught the warm dust of Thebes, its plaster still cool to the touch. The lintel bore the carved eye of Horus, its lines softened by years of hand polish, while small beetle motifs nestled beside the jambs, their wings etched in low relief. Inside, Murret shuffled a basket of frankincense, the fragrant grain slipping through her fingers as she arranged fresh reeds for the upcoming ceremony. Children's laughter drifted from the courtyard, rattling the thin clay pots that leaned against the wall, and a faint breeze carried the scent of Nile reeds across the threshold. The household moved with a quiet rhythm, each motion a small affirmation that the home would remain, for now, untouched by the world beyond the door. As twilight deepened, a low, rustling whisper slipped through the cracks, a chill that seemed to follow the outline of a serpent without form. The The air grew heavier, and the painted eyes on the lintel appeared to pulse, as if the stone itself were listening to a distant, unseen hiss. Neferet felt a prickle along her forearms, the subtle tremor of a presence that ancient scribes had called the serpent of chaos, though its menace felt more like a draft than a roar. Murret steadied her breath, her chant low and steady, the syllables sliding over the stone like water against sand. The scarab reliefs along the jambs seemed to shift, the tiny beetles catching a faint glint of amber light that fell from the doorway's threshold. Outside, the night's first insects began their chorus, their sound a soft counterpoint to the uneasy pressure that lingered at the entrance. It was oddly comforting to watch the very symbols meant to repel darkness appear to wobble under the weight of their own legend. The Eye of Horus, intended as an unwavering sentinel, now seemed to blink in rhythm with Murret's chant, as if the ancient artisans had left a hinge for modern doubt. Even the scarabs, usually steadfast carriers of rebirth, wobble like tired librarians turning pages that have long been read. Neferet smiled faintly, noting the quiet absurdity that a design carved centuries ago could be both the shield and the source of the house's nervous energy. The household's routine milling grain, mending jars, continued, a reminder that daily life often carries its own subtle defenses against imagined threats. When the chanting reached its crescendo, a thin plume of incense rose, spreading warm amber across the doorway and softening the chill that had crept in. The carved eye flickered briefly, a muted amber flare that seemed to push back against the darkness, while the beetle reliefs caught the light and glimmered like polished amber stones. Murret lifted her staff, the wooden shaft cool, and pressed it lightly against the threshold, feeling the faint vibration of the stone settle. The rustling whisper retreated, absorbed by the scent of frankincense and the steady rhythm of the chant, leaving the doorway quiet once more. Neferet exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing as the night air settled into a gentle, unhurried coolness. The household resumed its ordinary sounds, the clink of water jars, the soft shuffle of sandals, each echo a testament to the ordinary triumph over the unseen. In the quiet that followed, Neferet lingered by the doorway, fingers tracing the worn lines of the eye, feeling the subtle grain of the stone beneath her palm. She thought of the countless ancestors who had placed the same symbols, each hoping their craftsmanship could hold back a darkness only partly understood. The irony remained. Protection had arrived not from a single miracle, but from the patient persistence of ordinary hands shaping stone and resin. As the night deepened, the soft glow of oil lamps flickered, casting gentle shadows that reminded her that even stillness holds the memory of past struggles. With a quiet sigh, she turned back into the house, leaving the doorway to stand as a modest guard, its purpose rooted in human effort rather than divine decree. In the early light of a Nile-kissed morning, Murat lowered the freshly carved wooden lintel over her doorway. Its surface, painted with ochre bands and tiny scarab motifs that had been smoothed by generations of hands. The faint scent of reed mat and sun-baked mud lingered in the doorway, while the soft scrape of the brush against the wood seemed to mark a quiet promise of safety. Villagers passed by, their sandals whispering against the sand-strewn path, nodding politely at the familiar pattern that marked a household's care. Inside, the hearth crackled gently, sending a warm amber glow to the walls, as Murat paused to straighten a stray reed that threatened to disturb the arrangement. The scene unfolded slowly, as if time itself were taking a breath before the day's work began. Later that afternoon, a chill slipped through the cracked lintel, unnoticed at first, until the air grew heavy, and the faint rattling of unseen threads sent a shiver across the room. The scarab motifs, once still, seemed to pulse faintly, their painted eyes catching a glint of dusk that did not belong to the surrounding landscape. A low, rhythmic thud resonated from the doorway as the spirit's presence pressed against the boundary, testing the ancient symbols with a persistence that felt both ancient and impatient. Murat's fingers tightened around the edge of the wooden frame, feeling the grain cool beneath her palm as she whispered a steady chant, her voice barely rising above the fire's crackle. The tension lingered, a thin veil of uncertainty that settled like dust after a disturbed silence. From across the lane, the neighboring family watched with a mixture of curiosity and reluctant admiration as the doorway's decoration flickered and steadied, their own entrance still plain and unadorned. Their patriarch, who had often scoffed at such superstitious embellishments, now lowered his gaze, noticing the faint amber luminescence that seemed to repel the creeping cold. A small, ironic smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the kind that acknowledges a lesson learned too late to change his own simple doorway. He lifted a cup of warm barley water, its steam curling lazily upward, and offered it to Murat as a silent apology for his earlier dismissal. The gesture, modest and unspoken, carried the weight of humility as the neighboring children watched the glow with eyes half opened, half sleeping. As the sun sank beyond the dunes, the scarab designs settled into a steady, soft glow, their light warm enough to touch the stone walls without overwhelming the room's quiet. The air grew still, the earlier chill fading like a receded tide, leaving behind a comfortable warmth that settled into the bones of those within. Murret stepped back, feeling the smoothness of the wooden lintel under her fingertips, the texture now reassuring rather than tense. The neighboring family lingered at the threshold, their faces blurred by the dimming light, accepting the calm that the decorations provided without demanding words. In the hush that followed, the village's collective breath seemed to synchronize. Each household's entrance now a quiet sentinel against the unseen. In the weeks that followed, the practice spread like a gentle ripple across the settlement. Every home began to frame its doorway with modest carvings, each scarab and band echoing the same patient protection. Children learned to dust the lintels with softened reeds, the rhythmic sweep becoming a lullaby of routine rather than ritual. The elders, whose faces were always half shadowed by the setting sun, noted the subtle shift in tone, from fear of the unknown to confidence in a shared tradition. Even the river's quiet murmur seemed to acknowledge the change, its flow matching the steady heartbeat of a community that had chosen quiet vigilance over frantic alarm. As night settled, the whole village glowed faintly from within, a tapestry of soft amber light that promised continuity, comfort, and the gentle endurance of ordinary guardianship. In the fading light of Thebes, the modest courtyard of Nefret and Calm hummed with the soft rustle of palm fronds. Nefret moved between clay jars, feeling the cool grit of sand on her fingertips as she measured barley for the night's bread. The hearth, a low stone platform, glowed amber, casting gentle shadows that slipped across the whitewashed walls. Beside it, a small wooden altar held a handful of incense, its smoke curling like quiet breath toward the evening sky. The couple placed fresh dates and a jar of lightly fermented barley beer on a shallow dish, a quiet ritual that linked their daily labor to the unseen ancestors. As the sun sank further, a distant caravan's chatter drifted into the courtyard, bringing the faint scent of cumin from foreign lands. Calm paused, his hand lingering over the barley, wondering whether the new spice might improve the offering or disturb the familiar balance. Nefret sensed his hesitation, the tightness in his shoulders mirroring the crackling of the fire. Their neighbor, Amun, had recently begun using imported honey, and the subtle competition lingered like a thin layer of ash on the altar. The couple exchanged a brief glance, each aware that the comfort of tradition was being nudged by the quiet pressure of change. When the bowl of beer was finally set, a small mouse scurried across the stone, pausing to sniff the spilled droplets before disappearing into a crack. The sight reminded Nefret of the paradox, that the very sustenance meant for the invisible spirits often attracted the very mundane creatures of the floor. Calm chuckled softly, the sound barely audible over the crackle, as he realized that the gods might be more patient than the house cats. The offering, meticulously prepared, now shared its scent with dust and wind, a silent negotiation between reverence and reality. In that moment, the solemnity of the ritual felt almost theatrical, a staged pause in the endless flow of daily chores. The night deepened, and the fire's glow settled into a steady, warm pulse that softened the edges of the courtyard. Nefrit pulled the woven mat closer, feeling the worn texture against her knees as she settled to watch the embers slow dance. Calm leaned against the stone wall, his breath steady, the faint scent of dates lingering like a sweet afterglow. Shadows lengthened, but the altar remained illuminated, its bronze figurines catching just enough light to suggest presence without demanding attention. The couple remained in quiet companionship, the rhythm of their breathing matching the slow rise and fall of the flame. In the hush that followed, Nefrit traced the outline of a faded hieroglyph on the wall, its lines blurred by centuries of dust and candlelight. She thought of the generations who had placed similar bowls before them, their hopes and worries distilled into simple grains and fermented barley. Calm's hand rested on the altar's base, feeling the cool stone and remembering that the offering was as much for the living as for the remembered. The courtyard, now empty of voices, seemed to hold a quiet reverence for the continuity of ordinary devotion, a gentle reminder that history often lives in these small, repeated gestures. With a soft sigh, they turned inward, letting the night's calm settle like a blanket, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same modest ceremony, unchanged, yet ever slightly different. When the Nile's flood withdrew to its familiar thin ribbon, Nefrit stood on the cracked mud of the courtyard, feeling the cool dusk settle on the limestone walls, and hearing the distant clatter of pots. The household hearth, a low stone basin, glowed faintly, its ember light reminding her of the seasonal rhythm that had guided her ancestors. In the quiet of that evening, she remembered the barley cake, soft, honey-kissed, and once offered to the unseen spirit of the hearth before the first bite of the night meal. The scent of barley, long absent from the pantry, seemed to drift like a memory through the doorway. She felt a gentle but persistent tug, as if the house itself whispered that the offering should not be forgotten this year. Later, as the neighbors' family gathered around a rough wooden table, Nefrit watched their hands knead a pale dough made from imported wheat, its texture slick and unfamiliar under the soft lamp oil light. The wheat's white dust rose in thin clouds, contrasting with the earthy tones of their own empty jars, and a low murmur rose among the women about the practicality of the substitute. A subtle tension settled, not in raised voices, but in the careful pause before each need, as each participant wondered whether the spirit of the hearth would accept a cake that smelled of foreign grain. The air grew heavier with the faint crackle of firewood and the rustle of linen. The ordinary act of feeding the family now seemed a small test of reverence. Nefret's fingers brushed the cool stone, feeling the lingering warmth of previous offerings, and she sensed that the household's quiet guardians might be listening. Determined, Nefret trekked to the market stalls, where merchants displayed sacks of barley under canvas awnings, the grains gleaming amber in the waning sun. The vendor's voice was low, his hands dusted with flour as he measured out a modest handful for her, his eyes hidden beneath a wide brim that cast shadows over his face. Ironically, the barley was labeled for ritual use. Yet the same grain was being sold to farmers for animal feed, a reminder that the line between sacred and mundane had thinned like the river's flow. She returned home with the modest sack, its weight light but its significance palpable, and laid the barley beside the hearth, feeling the stone's warmth seep into the grains. The quiet irony of seeking a forgotten recipe in a world that had already begun to rewrite its own customs lingered in the soft click of the door closing behind her. Back in the kitchen, Nefret mixed barley with honey, the amber liquid pooling like sunset on the workbench, while the fire crackled gently, sending tiny sparks up toward the vaulted ceiling. The batter thickened under her palm, sticky and fragrant, and as she poured it into a modest clay pan, the scent of toasted grain filled the room, mingling with the distant call of waterfowl beyond the riverbank. The household gathered silently, each face softened by the low light, their eyes tracing the slow rise of the cake as it browned. A subtle smile passed across their features, as if the simple act of making a humble offering was enough to soothe any lingering unease. The moment stretched, a quiet tableau of ordinary movements, stirring, waiting, breathing each one, a slow affirmation of continuity despite changing circumstances. In that stillness, the spirit of the hearth seemed less a strict overseer and more a patient companion, content with the genuine intent behind the offering. When the cake was finally set on the low table, its crust golden and its edges slightly cracked, Nefret observed the quiet gratitude that settled over the family like a soft blanket. The night deepened, the cool air brushing the stone walls, and the hearth's glow dimmed to embers, casting gentle shadows that softened the lines of the occupants' faces. In that reflective hush, she realized that the ritual's power lay not in the exact grain, but in the shared attention to a common heart, a modest act that tied present hands to generations past. The subtle lesson lingered, that human imperfection, when met with patient care, could still honor the unseen guardians of home. As the night stretched on, the house settled into a calm rhythm, the scent of barley cake lingering like a quiet promise for the seasons to come. At dusk, the family altar was brushed with a thin layer of dust, and a small scarab amulet lay beside the cracked clay jar, its beetle wings catching the amber light that filtered through the open window. The house cat, sleek and normally indifferent, curled on the woven mat and began to cough, its breath shallow as the night air grew cooler. Simultaneously, the dough that Calm had kneaded for the morning loaf sat heavy in the bowl, refusing to rise despite the warm hand that pressed it. The scent of stagnant wheat lingered, muffling the subtle crackle of the oil lamp that held its flame steady. In the quiet of the hallway, the family sensed an unfamiliar weight settle over the ritual, as if the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. Calm, his palms still tinged with flour, frowned at the stillness of the dough, and asked quietly whether the old verses still commanded the offering. Nefrit, arranging fresh figs on a linen tray, responded with a measured tone, urging a stricter observance of the nightly prayers that had guided their ancestors. Their words brushed each other like dry reeds, neither storming nor retreating. Yet the tension rose like the heat off the baked clay. The cat's soft whimper echoed against the plaster, a reminder that the household's balance hinged on something as fragile as a feline breath. Outside, the Nile brushed its banks with a muted rush, indifferent to the dispute within its shadowed banks. When the scarab's polished carapace caught a stray ember, a faint glow seemed to pulse, and an unspoken suggestion rippled through the room. A feast more elaborate than any they had prepared before. Calm laughed lowly, the sound dry as broken pottery, noting the irony of a beetle demanding a banquet while the cat lay still. Nefrit, eyes lingering on the amulet, whispered that perhaps the gods were testing their humility with a modest request for more barley and honey. The household kitchen, usually filled with the steady rhythm of grinding grain, now felt the hush of anticipation. Each spoonful of water measured with deliberate slowness, the absurdity of a tiny relic, influencing the scale of their meals, settled like dust on the far side of the hearth. After a moment of shared silence, the couple slipped into a quiet compromise, laying a modest offering of flatbread, a handful of lentils, and a single sprig of lotus beside the scarab. The flame of the lamp flickered, casting soft shadows that danced gently over the scarab's curve, as if approving the simplicity of the act. The cat, sensing the softened atmosphere, lifted its head and rested its head on Nefrit's lap, the purr a low vibration against the stone floor. The dough, now given a gentle tap, and a warm blanket of cloth began to swell in a gentle, patient rise. The house settled into a steady rhythm again, the earlier unease melting into the soft hum of evening insects beyond the courtyard wall. Later, as the night deepened and the scarab lay still on the altar, calm and Nefrit whispered about the day's strange turn, noting how a small object could stir the heart of a home without demanding grand gestures. They reflected on the quiet lesson that devotion, like bread, needed time, warmth, and the humility to accept imperfect rise. The cat's breathing steadied. The scent of night jasmine seeped through the cracked window, and the walls seemed to exhale a sigh of patience. In the steady glow of the lamp, the couple recognized that the true offering was not the abundance of food, but the shared patience that held their lineage together. The scarab, its facets dimming in the soft light, remained a silent witness to the calm that followed the storm. At the first blush of Opit, the household of Sawara gathered beneath the amber glow of the courtyard lanterns. The scent of cumin and dried dates drifting from the kitchen hearth. Women laid out clay bowls of spiced lentils, while the baker's apprentice dusted fresh flatbread with sesame, each grain warm to the touch. The eldest son arranged a copper tray of honeyed figs beside a modest altar carved from limestone, its surface worn smooth by generations of fingertip prayers. The family murmured the ancient verses, voices low and steady, as the evening wind brushed through the papyrus shutters. In that quiet choreography, the world seemed to pause, waiting for the offering to settle like a stone set in sand. As the night deepened, a nervous tension crept among the youngest hands, wary of spilling the fragrant lentils or bruising the delicate figs. The mother, her sleeves stained with flour, steadied a wooden ladle, feeling its cool weight and the pulse of the flame beneath the altar. A stray breeze rattled the window panes, sending a shiver through the room that threatened to unsettle the careful arrangement. Yet the family moved with deliberate slowness, each placement made with a tactile reverence, as if the very act of setting down food could tip a hidden scale. The air grew thicker, scented with incense, and the quiet anticipation hung like a thin veil over the scene. Just as the final loaf was positioned, a startled cat slipped from a shadowed corner, its paws landing on the woven mat with a soft thud, and the scarab amulet beside the altar emitted a faint, amber pulse. The unexpected glow seemed to mock the solemnity of the moment. A tiny sun caught in amber stone, while the cat brushed against the honeyed figs, leaving a faint, lingering scent of fur on the sweet flesh. The family exchanged a restrained smile, their eyes briefly meeting the blurred silhouette of a distant figure, its face hidden in the flickering light of the offering flame. The irony of a mundane animal, and an insect's glow receiving equal reverence softened the tension, turning it into a gentle chuckle that settled into the dust of the floor tiles. In the gentle hum of night insects outside, the ceremony acquired a subtle, humanizing layer. When the flame on the altar steadied, its orange tongues rose higher, casting a warm, steady glow that seemed to embrace the spread of food like a quiet guardian. The air softened, the heat brushing the backs of the participants, and the sound of distant river reeds whispered through the courtyard. The family inhaled together, feeling the comforting weight of tradition settle around them as the offering was accepted in silence. The lingering scent of baked bread mingled with the faint perfume of lotus incense, creating a calm that felt as ancient as the stones beneath their feet. In that stillness, each breath became a measured count, a reminder that the ritual's power lay not in spectacle, but in the patient presence of ordinary hands. Later, as the lanterns dimmed and the night grew deeper, the family lingered beside the altar, the empty plates cooling under the night sky. The eldest reflected on how the simple act of preparing food, with its occasional missteps and unnoticed humor, had woven a thread of continuity between generations. The blurred silhouette of the unseen deity lingered in the periphery, a reminder that balance is kept not by grand gestures, but by the quiet consistency of daily care. The cat curled into the warm ember of the hearth, and the scarab, now dim, rested beside the figs. Its glow faded, but its presence noted. In that lingering hush, the household felt an unspoken promise that as long as they offered their modest sustenance with sincerity, the home would remain a steady harbor against the restless tides of time. In the warm courtyard of a modest Theban home, the scent of baked barley mingles with the dry river breeze as Nefret arranges flat loaves on a low stone altar. Her hands, steady from years of kneading, place a handful of honey-drizzled figs beside a tiny clay jar of oil, each offering laid out with the quiet precision of a daily ritual. The family watches from the doorway, the children's eyes reflecting the amber glow of the setting sun, while the unseen face of an ancestor lingers in the shadowed doorway. Just a suggestion of reverence. The sound of a distant reed flute drifts across the mud brick walls, underscoring the ordinary yet sacred rhythm of the evening. In this still moment, the act of offering feels both a nourishment and a silent pact with whatever watches from beyond the clay. Later, a sudden gust rattles the open shutters, and a stray ember from the hearth jumps onto the edge of the altar, singeing the edge of a loaf with a faint hiss. The family stiffens, the quiet crackle of flame echoing the tension that tightens the room like a drawn bowstring. Nefret's palm brushes the cool stone, feeling the heat rise while her brother mutters an understated apology to the blurred silhouette that seems to shift with the flickering light. The air grows heavier, scented now with a hint of burnt grain, and the children exchange uneasy glances, their earlier curiosity dimming to a tentative watchfulness. The moment holds a fragile balance between reverence and the fear of having disturbed the delicate exchange of nourishment and protection. As the ember sputters out, a soft chuckle ripples through the courtyard, not from the family, but from the wind itself, carrying the faint rustle of papyrus pages that have long been forgotten. Nefret smiles wryly, noticing that the charred edge of the loaf resembles a tiny, accidental mask, a reminder that even solemn offerings can bear a touch of the absurd. The unseen ancestor's presence seems to soften, the shadowy outline giving way to a faint outline of amused light, as if acknowledging the imperfection with a gentle, unseen nod. The family relaxes, the tension evaporating like steam from the hot oil, and the children begin to mimic the gentle clatter of their mother's spoon against the stone. In the quiet irony of a slightly ruined offering, the ritual reclaims its humanity, reminding all present that devotion is lived through imperfect hands. The evening settles into a mellow hush. Nefret unrolls a fresh strip of papyrus, the texture cool against her fingertips, and begins to copy the recipes and the steps of the ritual in a measured, deliberate script. The candlelight flickers against the walls, casting a soft amber wash that paints the family's faces with a gentle, sleepy glow, while the altar glows faintly, its modest fire now a steady ember rather than a startled blaze. Each line she writes carries the weight of the day's small drama, yet the tone remains calm, as if the papyrus itself absorbs the quiet laughter and the lingering scent of honey. The children sit nearby, their legs swinging gently, listening to the scratch of reed pen as if it were a lullaby. By the time the scroll is rolled, the courtyard feels stitched together by the simple continuity of shared meals and the unhurried passage of generations. When the scroll is finally placed in a wooden box lined with linen, the family gathers around the altar one last time, feeling the soft heat of the ember as a silent promise of continuity. The night deepens, and the courtyard's shadows lengthen, but the glow from the altar remains steady, a quiet beacon of love conveyed through grain, oil, and the echo of a shared story. Nefret watches her younger siblings, their faces half lit, and senses that the ritual they have witnessed will ripple through future celebrations. Each bite of bread, a reminder of their bond and the unseen guardians they honor. The air holds a gentle, lingering perfume of figs and incense, a sensory record that no spoken sermon could capture. In this reflective pause, the household understands that the true power of their offerings lies not in the divine approval they seek, but in the memory they forge together, night after night. In the early afternoon, the mud brick market of Uruk buzzed with the clatter of clay jug sellers and the low murmur of bartered wheat. Among the stalls, a thin plume of sweet onion scent drifted upward, curling around the stone base of the bronze statue of Inanna, whose face was forever hidden in the soft shadow of a woven canopy. Naram, a young scribe with ink-stained fingers, paused his scroll-selling routine to watch a group of women twist fresh onion stalks into a simple wreath. The garland slipped over the statue's neck with a faint rustle, the layers of the bulbs catching the light like pale rings. A nearby potter's apprentice tipped a clay cup, spilling a splash of cool water that mirrored the gentle motion of the garland. The moment felt ordinary, yet somehow marked the market with a quiet pause, as if the city inhaled the fragrance together. Later that day in Lilitu, the temple's senior priestess called Naram to the cool shade of the inner courtyard, her robe brushing the flagstones with a muted rustle. She gestured toward the onion garland, its layers now damp from the evening breeze, and asked him to record its origins before the next moonrise. Naram felt a knot of unease grow as he remembered rival scribes from Lagash who claimed similar wreaths in their own rights, a dispute that had once sparked heated debates in the city council. The weight of the task settled on his shoulder like the heavy clay of a newly molded tablet, and the distant chant of a priest's drum seemed to echo his rising pulse. Yet the courtyard's air remained warm, and the faint crackle of fire from the hearth reminded him that the work was a continuation of everyday record-keeping, not a prophecy. He accepted the assignment with a measured nod, aware that each line he would carve might bridge a gap between neighboring peoples. The next morning, Naram traveled the dusty road to the riverbank settlement of Larsa, where traders displayed bundles of onions beside baskets of dates. There, he observed a group of laborers fastening the same type of onion wreath to the handles of their carts, not as offering, but as a practical way to keep insects away from the grain they hauled. The sight made him smile faintly. The very symbol his mentor treated as sacred was, in this context, merely a humble pest repellent. He noted that even the faces of the overseers, their eyes hidden behind wide-brimmed hats, were blurred by the bright glare of the midday sun, reinforcing the anonymity of ritual. The irony deepened when a child offered the garland to a wandering goat, and the animal accepted it with a contented bleat, turning the solemn object into a simple plaything. Naram recorded these observations on a wax tablet, his ink tracing the unexpected layers of meaning that a single plant could hold across cultures. Returning to Uruk, Naram settled onto the low stone bench beneath the mulberry tree that shaded the temple courtyard, the evening air cooling his skin. He unrolled a fresh parchment, its ivory surface catching the last amber glow of the setting sun, and began to copy the details of the onion garland with deliberate strokes. The rustling leaves above whispered in a rhythm that matched the gentle scrape of his stylus, creating a steady backdrop that steadied his thoughts. As he traced the concentric rings of the bulbs, the scent of the wilted onions lingered, reminding him of the market's pulse without intruding on his focus. A distant water carrier's bucket clanged softly against a stone basin, a sound that blended into the tranquil hum of the courtyard. The work proceeded slowly, each line a quiet acknowledgement that history often rests in such unhurried moments. When the final ink dried, Naram stepped back to view his tablet, noticing how the recorded layers resembled the very rings of the onion garland he had studied. He realized that each culture's use of the simple plant was a thin veneer covering deeper human concerns, protection, celebration, and the desire to be remembered. The blurred faces of the priests and the unseen eyes of the market's participants taught him that much of history remains concealed, revealed only by the scent of everyday objects. In the quiet of the night, the statue of Inanna stood still, the garland now a faint shadow against the stone, a reminder that rituals persist even as their meanings shift. Naram felt a gentle gratitude for the ordinary moments that tethered his city to its neighbors, a soft acknowledgement that humanity's story is built one layered whisper at a time. With a calm breath, he closed his tablet, letting the lingering aroma of onions fade into the cool night, and allowed the city's rhythm to lull him toward sleep. Naram follows the slow bend of the Euphrates, the river's surface shimmering like brushed copper under the noon sun. The mud brick walls of the temple of Nana rise ahead, their corners softened by years of wind-worn plaster. Inside the courtyard, women sit cross-legged on woven mats, their hands deftly threading thin strips of onion skin into spiraling garlands. The faint, sharp perfume of the onions rises with the warm air, mingling with the rustle of palm fronds swaying in a lazy breeze. He pauses at the threshold, noting how the concentric layers of each bulb seem to echo the waxing moon above the distant riverbank. The heat presses against Naram's skin, making the stone floor feel like a warm stone slab under his soles. He watches a group of artisans laboring at low tables, their fingers slipping between the pungent layers, pulling ribbons that curl like thin moons. The rhythm of their work is steady, yet a subtle tension flickers in the way they glance toward the temple doorway, as if waiting for an unseen signal. A soft chant drifts from the inner sanctum, its echo muffled by the thick walls, hinting at a purpose that feels both practical and ceremonial. The scent grows stronger, and Naram feels the sting of the onions in his eyes, a reminder that the garlands are as much a test of endurance as they are a tribute. He wonders whether the effort is meant to bind the community together, or simply to fill the air with a protective aroma. An ironic smile seems to settle on the faces of the craftsmen, though their features remain blurred by the shadows cast from the oil lamps. They place the finished garlands on low stone altars, the layers of the onions catching the dim light and resembling miniature lunar crescents. The very fragrance meant to keep malevolent spirits at bay also provokes occasional tears, as anyone who inhales too deeply finds his eyes watering in quiet defiance of the intended calm. A priest with a veil of light over his head gestures toward the arrangement, his silhouette indistinct, as if the ritual itself prefers anonymity. Naram notes how the solemnity of the rite is undercut by the mundane act of cutting onion skins, a reminder that grand intentions often rest on humble, even irritating, foundations. Evening settles over the temple, cooling the stone and softening the harsh scent into a faint, sweet undertone. The moon, a pale disk rising from the horizon, casts a gentle silver wash across the courtyard, illuminating the orange-tinged garlands with a quiet reverence. The artisans sit back, shoulders relaxing, as the night breeze carries the lingering onion aroma through the colonnades. Their conversations drift lazily, punctuated by the occasional clink of a ceramic cup against a wooden tray, a sound as unhurried as the river beyond. In this stillness, Naram feels the world contract to the simple rhythm of breath and observation, the ritual's purpose dissolving into a shared moment of peaceful presence. When the moon reaches its highest point, Naram lingers at the doorway, watching the gentle sway of the onion garlands against the far wall. He reflects on how humans have long tried to mirror celestial cycles with the most ordinary of materials, finding meaning in the layers of a humble bulb. The faint tears that formed on his cheeks earlier now dry, leaving only the memory of a scent that once seemed both protective and intrusive. The blurred figures of the priests fade into the background, their presence more a suggestion than a proclamation, reminding Naram that history often hides its actors behind soft light. With a slow, steady exhale, he turns back toward the river, carrying the quiet lesson that the world's grand patterns are woven from the simple, imperfect threads of daily life. Naram, a quiet scholar with sand-stained boots, steps onto the silt of the Nile Delta at dusk, the air heavy with the river reeds. He watches a procession of priests moving slowly along the mud-darkened path, each bearing an onion garland that glints amber in the waning light. The onions are plaited tightly, their layers catching a cool breeze that carries a sharp, earthy perfume. A low drumbeat murmurs like distant water, and the priest's linen robes rustle softly against the limestone walls. Naram feels the weight of generations pressing gently against his shoulders, as if the garlands themselves are threads linking past to present. Further north, the landscape shifts to the rocky terraces of the Levant, where shepherds gather under a pale sky that tastes of dust and distant fire. They braid onion crowns into the hair of young women, the greens bruised by gentle hands that snap the stems with a quiet pop. The shepherds' flutes emit a thin, lilting tune that competes with the occasional bleat of goats, creating a thin tapestry of sound that feels both festive and uneasy. Naram notes the subtle rivalry in the way each group guards its own ritual, the scent of onions rising like a question in the still air. He senses a tension, a delicate balancing act between shared reverence and the desire to own a distinct tradition. In a moment of quiet absurdity, Naram watches a child accidentally drop a garland into a puddle, the onions soaking and releasing a steam that fogs the surrounding faces. The priests pause, their solemn eyes hidden behind the shadows of their hoods, as the water ripples with a soft hiss. The shepherds laugh softly, the sound catching on the wind like a muted joke about the pungent perfume that now drifts upward. That simple mishap underscores an irony. The very thing that is meant to ward off decay and protect the dead is prone to the same decay when it meets moisture. Naram feels a restrained smile tug at his lips, the scene reminding him how human clumsiness can soften even the most solemn rites. As night settles, the two groups converge near a shared well, the stone surface cool to the touch under the moon's pale glow. They exchange quiet nods, their onion garlands hovering in the stillness, the layers catching faint silver reflections. A shared bowl of barley tea steams between them, the mild bitterness mixing with the lingering sharpness of the onions, creating a calm, almost meditative aroma. The priests and shepherds speak in low, measured tones, their words barely rising above the gentle lapping of water against the well's edge. Naram watches the ritual unfold with a slow, steady heart, feeling the common pulse of fertility and protection beat quietly across cultures. When the lamps are finally extinguished, Naram lingers by the well, his fingers tracing the cool stone as the onion scent fades into the night. He reflects on how the simple act of binding layers of a vegetable can stitch together distant peoples, offering a modest shield against time's erosion. The blurred silhouettes of the priests and the shepherds' faces linger in his memory like shadows that never fully resolve, emphasizing the anonymity of devotion. In the hush, the gentle rustle of reeds and distant hooves become a soft soundtrack to his contemplation, reminding him that history moves at the pace of a breath. Naram departs with a quiet gratitude, carrying the lingering warmth of onion garlands as a reminder of humanity's tender, imperfect continuity. At the dry riverbank of the Euphrates, the great hall of Mari opened its clay doors to a gathering of scribes, merchants, and priests, each carrying a thin garland of fresh onion skins that rustled softly against their shoulders. The air was warm, tasting of baked barley and the faint pungency of the onions, while lamps cast a steady amber glow on the terracotta floor. In the center, a low wooden table bore a shallow basin of water, reflecting the flickering light like a quiet mirror. Voices settled into a low murmur as participants took their seats on woven mats, the rustle of parchment echoing the gentle crack of firewood. The council began under the watchful eyes of statues, whose faces were forever veiled by shadow, their presence a muted reminder of tradition. The first speaker, a scholar from Ebla, lifted his garland and argued that the onion symbolized fertility, pointing to the layered bulbs as a visual echo of sowing and harvest. Arrival from ashore countered with a steady tone, insisting the same garlands marked the passage of seasonal rites, their concentric rings marking the turning of the calendar. Their words rose like the heat of the hearth, each claim punctuated by the tap of a stylus against tablet, the sound sharp against the otherwise hushed room. Listeners shifted on their cushions, the scent of onions growing sharper as the debate heated, while a few scribes whispered in the margins of their scrolls. The tension gathered like a thin veil of steam above the water basin, neither fully forming nor dissipating. Amid the rising agitation, a minor official from the city of Babylon adjusted his sandal, inadvertently scattering a few dried onion scales across the floor, a tiny rustling that drew a brief, collective chuckle. The laughter was muted, as if the stone walls themselves were sighing, and the blurred silhouettes of the senior priests' faces, hidden by the glow of oil lamps, seemed to relax a fraction. The scholars, still earnest, found themselves comparing the layered onions to the layers of argument they had built, an unspoken irony that the very object of their contention could also be a modest kitchen staple. A steward passed a cup of warm millet broth, its steam mingling with the onion aroma, and the simple act of sipping softened the edge of each voice. The room settled into a rhythm where the sound of a spoon against a bowl matched the occasional clink of a garland being readjusted, a quiet counterpoint to the earlier fervor. Just as the evening light turned a deeper amber, an elder storyteller stepped forward, his robe dusted with sand, and placed a weathered clay vessel on the table, its surface etched with a single spiral. He spoke in a voice that matched the soft rustle of the onion skins, recounting a forgotten myth of a primordial bulb that burst from the earth, its layers giving rise to the first gardens and the first gatherings of humans. The tale wove together the themes each culture had claimed as theirs, suggesting that the onion's concentric rings were not a symbol of division, but of shared origin, each layer a memory of a common ancestor. As he described the first peoples wrapping their wrists with the bulb's skins to honor the earth, the gathered scholars found their eyes lingering on the same garlands they had argued over, now illuminated by a gentle understanding. The room fell into a steady hush, the only sounds the faint crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind through the open doorway. When the storyteller's words faded, the participants lingered, their hands resting lightly on the onion garlands, feeling the cool, papery texture against warm skin. The earlier disputes seemed as distant as the echo of a market day, replaced by a quiet appreciation for the shared layers of history that bound their cities together. Some scribes traced the faint lines of the garlands, noting how each onion had been harvested at dawn, the chill of the early light still present in the delicate layers. The council closed without a formal resolution, but with a collective nod that the true meaning lay not in ownership, but in the humility of being part of a larger, ever-growing circle. As night settled over Mari, the lamps dimmed, and the empty hall retained the faint scent of onions, a lingering reminder that even the smallest vegetable can hold the weight of civilization's quiet continuity. In the dust-kissed courtyard of Uruk, Naram unfolded a thin tablet, its surface still warm from the fire that dried the ink. He traced the faint outlines of onion garlands that had once circled the hips of Sumerian dancers, Egyptian brides, and Canaanite mourners, feeling the cool bite of the dried bulbs in his memory. The quiet murmur of the river beyond blended with the soft scrape of reed stylus, marking the first line of a comparative study that promised to join three distant traditions. Around him, the market stalls lingered in a slow rhythm, sellers arranging baskets of onions that sighed under the weight of their layers. With each measured stroke, the beginning of his codex felt like a gentle tide, pulling the disparate threads toward a shared shore. As Naram moved deeper into the archives, the parchment grew heavier, its edges frayed by countless hands that had once whispered the same verses. The air grew thicker with the smell of wet clay, and the faint echo of distant chants, amplifying a subtle tension between reverence and doubt. He wrestled with the divergent symbolism. In Sumer, the garland signaled fertility. In Egypt, it marked the cycle of rebirth. In Canaan, it accompanied lamentation. The crack of a distant loom and the rustle of palm leaves reminded him that each culture wove its own narrative. Yet the onion's layered skin seemed stubbornly uniform. The tension settled like a slow-moving sandstorm, urging him to reconcile the contradictions without losing the quiet dignity of each voice. When the final verses were set, Naram could not help but notice the irony of recording a symbol of renewal on a tablet that would soon turn brittle under the desert sun. The onion, peeled layer by layer, had become a metaphor for his own scholarly process. Each removed skin exposing a simpler truth that was perhaps no more important than the next. A stray mouse scurried across the floor, brushing against a stack of scrolls, its tiny feet stirring dust that glittered like forgotten stars. The quiet chuckle of a passing scribe, amused by the solemnity of the task, reminded Naram that history often hides its gravitas behind ordinary gestures. In the soft glow of oil lamps, the irony settled like a warm blanket, comforting rather than mocking his endeavor. With the codex complete, Naram carried it back through the winding alleys, the stone walls absorbing the faint clack of his sandals and the distant murmur of the market winding down. The evening air had cooled, wrapping the city in a sigh of amber light that brushed the statues of Inanna with a gentle sheen. He placed the manuscript beside the venerable statue, its basalt surface cool to the touch, and brushed a thin layer of sand over its spine, as if tucking it into sleep. The quiet of the courtyard deepened, punctuated only by the occasional chirp of night insects and the rustle of onion leaves drying on a nearby wall. In that still moment, the comparative study rested, its pages fluttering like soft breaths in the calm night. Later, as the moon rose pale over Uruk, Naram lingered by the statue, feeling the faint pulse of ancient stories echoing through the stone. He imagined future hands, perhaps a child's curious fingers, or an elder's weathered palm, turning the pages, each discovering the same layered renewal the onion once symbolized. The distant sound of water lapping against the riverbank reminded him that cycles endure, indifferent to the fleeting concerns of any single generation. The cool night air brushed his cheek, and the faint scent of onions lingered, a reminder that ordinary objects often carry the weight of timeless continuity. With a quiet sigh, Naram stepped back into the shadows, leaving the codex to rest in patient silence, its legacy woven into the fabric of everyday life.